Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris, and welcome to today's guest interview. Our guest interviews are long-form interviews with leaders from around the world. They've each been selected because of their valuable perspective on leadership and work they've accomplished in this space. Today we're joined by Alain Hunkins, author and managing director of the Hunkins Leadership Group. Welcome, Alain. Say hi to our audience.
Hey, it's great to be with you today. And hello, audience. Excited to share some leadership ideas with you. Thank you.
Did I pronounce the name correctly?
It's pretty good. I've been called a lot worse, Chris. Yeah, Alain is actually, it's the French name. My mom is from Brussels, Belgium. Gave me a totally common French name, which was totally unusual growing up in Flushing, Queens.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So the first thing I'd like is for you to tell our audience kind of what you do for a living and how you ended up in that place.
Sure, yeah. So what I do is I help people to master the performing art of leadership. This is what I do. It's what I've been doing for nearly 25 years. Of course, when I was a kid, it wasn't something I thought I would ever do. I didn't even know this field existed. That being said, I think one question that has always burned in me since I was young was, why do people do what they do? I've always been fascinated by people, who they are, how they think, how they act and behave. And that has carried through. In undergrad, in college, I studied psychology, and then I actually got really interested in theater. I actually have a master's in fine arts from a professional acting school, which is in some ways kind of putting yourself under the microscope when it comes to human behavior. And then from there, transitioned into doing educational training and consulting in schools, actually junior high schools and high schools in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, with some pretty hardcore, intense school districts. And then from there, transitioned into working with corporate groups about 23 years ago. And what I noticed is that through all of this time, and I've worked with literally 2,000 or more groups in 25 countries at this point, what I've noticed is there are patterns of behavior when it comes to leadership, Chris. You know, there's patterns of what people do well, and there's patterns of what people do poorly. And what I found was, if I just took some notes, these patterns would reveal themselves, that the stories might be slightly different, but the patterns would keep showing up. And so I started taking these notes, and the notes I turned into a blog. And the blogs ended up becoming chapters, and the chapters became this book that I just wrote. And it's a distillation to help so many of us who are on the leadership path. We're looking for what can we do to shorten our learning curve and accelerate our leadership growth. So that's how I ended up where I am.
That's awesome. My undergrad's in psychology as well. And I have found, maybe you can confirm this for you too, but I have found that the work that I do on leadership development was kind of stumbled upon because of a realization that it is required in order to solve the problems that I was actually trying to solve. And so I said to myself that my work was in employee engagement and that it was in the employee experience and all these different things that I was trying to solve problems for. And then I think over time, I realized that leadership was kind of the hub that made or broke all these other things that I was trying to fix. And so it was kind of accidental that I discovered that really what I'm trying to do is leadership development. Is that, is that kind of similar, or did you get there differently?
Yeah, I would say in some similar ways, because I started off with the whole idea, I was helping people to improve their productivity or improve their communication skills, but I realized those are all just vehicles for ultimately what we're all trying to do is to influence other people in some way to create some kind of a shared outcome. And to me, that's the definition of what leadership is. Leadership isn't about your job, your position, your title. Leadership is a state of mind, and it's a way of thinking and acting in the world where I realize that's why I call it the performing art of leadership. It is the performing art of mobilizing other people to willingly work with you towards some kind of a shared purpose. And if you use that definition, we're all leaders every day in every aspect of our lives.
Was there a watershed moment or a light bulb moment when you realized you had a passion for this and that you were good at it?
I got involved with facilitating some groups early on, and I was doing a kind of a big intensive group activity process. And there was a guy there who was very, very successful. And I, at the time, I was probably just 3 years out of college, and I was leading this thing. And part of the whole exercise was we had a chance to name the inner projections that we might have of someone else to their face, right? So it's kind of making the internal external, right? So it's a little bit of a risk taking in that. But I remember this guy came over to me, this very, very successful man in my mind, who was probably about 15 years older than me, and he said, I see a teacher in you. And there was something about that moment of he saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. And so that was a watershed moment that really made me realize that a lot of the gifts that I had around, acting is in some ways performing, and I love to be with people. But what I love the most is those aha light bulb moments where people start to make the connections where they can then take and apply those into their actions. So that was definitely a watershed moment for me.
I like that a lot. Was there any time throughout these years of doing this when you had a realization that something you had done or that you had been doing or a way you've been operating was just completely wrong and you had to kind of change everything around? You thought it was right, but you weren't getting the results you were looking for, or you were doing wrong by other people, and you just said, okay, this is wrong, I need to change this.
Yeah, I had a massive wake-up call in 1999. I remember it was in October of 1999. So at the time, I had been actually volunteering for a not-for-profit in New York City where I was living. And it's funny because the not-for-profit was actually focused on leadership development, which is ironic as you'll hear the story. So I've been volunteering for 3 years. I was like the super uber volunteer. I was doing all sorts of stuff. And the executive director stepped down. So there was this vacancy. And I thought, great, at this time, I'm about 27, 28 years old. I'm going to throw my hat into the ring. I'm going to be the new executive director. Now, the thing was, there was an election. There was this annual meeting, and that everyone that was involved could show up and vote for the person they wanted to vote for. So in my mind, I'm a total shoo-in for this job because no one has worked as hard as me. I know everyone who's involved. And it turns out this other guy named Gary had been around for about 6 months in the organization, and he decided he wanted to step up and do it too. And I just thought, oh, there's no way that Gary's going to ever get this. He's new. No one knows him. So I didn't worry about it. So we show up. It's the annual meeting. We have the election. Votes are all cast. Ballots are all counted. Final score, I see 38-6. My first thought is, yes, I crushed it. And then I had that moment of realization, realizing, no, actually, Gary got the 38 votes, and I got the 6. And I was just stunned. I was just shocked. And it took me a month before I could even meet and face Gary to talk about it. And when I did, I sort of somewhat jokingly, offhandedly said, so Gary, did you know you get all those votes? And what was amazing, Chris, is that he basically very straightforward said, well, of course I knew. And he explained what he had done. Basically, Gary, since he had gotten involved, he said, I started reaching out to people and getting to know them one-on-one. I went out for coffee or for lunch. And then I asked them why they were involved in the organization, what they liked about it, what they'd hoped to change. And then I shared with them my vision for the organization and how I had this vision of a whole team working together. And that on election day, I asked if they would show up and vote for me so we could become the team to make this happen. So as you can imagine, Chris, as Gary finishes this story, my head was exploding in this blinding flash of the obvious because everything he made complete sense, and I had done none of it, right? So I had been totally operating under the assumption that good work should speak for itself, that I had somehow was entitled or deserved this role because of all what I had done, and that everyone else should just know about this. And what I found from that experience with Gary is realizing leadership isn't about you being this great individual contributor who sort of has merited your way up the ranks and should be promoted, which is kind of the mindset I was coming from. So what Gary really modeled in that whole election victory is what I've come to understand is what I call the 3 secrets to building strong leaders, which is around connection, right? He reached out to people, communication, creating a dialogue, and then collaboration. And so that for me was this wonderful and horrible failure. At the same time, I say wonderful because it was a huge wake-up call and lesson to me that leadership isn't about what you do first, right? It's about understanding, it's about other people, and it's that connection, communication, and collaboration.
I love that story because we have very similar moments like that in terms of our wake-up calls. The only difference is I did get the promotion, and then I almost lost my job because of it, because I didn't know how to lead. I was the best individual contributor, and that's why I got the promotion, and the people who promoted me did it for the wrong reasons, and I almost failed. I almost lost my job. It was the most stressful time of my life that I can remember, and I had to really learn how to be a leader of people and how the skill sets are just totally different than being the best individual contributor. And so that's you if anything, what happened to you, it was a blessing in hindsight that you didn't get that role in terms of being able to do those things, unless you would have succeeded at those things, obviously.
And it's funny, and the more people I've told that story to, and how many of us, I think what you and I have both experienced around this is sort of this archetype, this sense that you basically get promoted past your level of competence, right?
Sure,
it's
the Peter principle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then this whole idea is then like you said, it's a totally different skill set. That being a contributor and being a leader are just apples and oranges.
Right. Well, I mean, there's plenty of studies out there that show that 2/3 to 3/4 of people who are in leadership roles have never had any formal leadership or management training at all. And if you think about the pool of people that self-select to apply for promotions and who are looked at by organizations for promotions, it's a natural tendency to go to the people who are doing the job well. I mean, who else do you look at? And I think there are organizations out there who they don't have the courage to look at people who have not done the role necessarily, but they have the leadership skills because they're trying to de-risk the decision themselves. They're trying to make sure that if the person fails who has been promoted, that they can say, well, look I promoted the person who did the job best. Don't blame me, blame the person who failed at doing the leadership role. Whereas if they step outside of that and say, yeah, I chose this person to get the job. They didn't actually do the role at all, but I've seen what they can do in terms of their relationships and their people leading abilities. And if that person fails, now the person who promoted them has their head on the chopping block for promoting the wrong person. So I think there's a lot of people who they don't want to take that risk themselves. And so they end up promoting the wrong person.
Yeah, that's a great point for sure.
If you had like kind of a piece of advice that you would give to a new leader to help them avoid making the mistakes that you have made, what would it be? How do you avoid that trap without the hindsight of having gone through it?
Part of it is, can you learn from other people's experience instead of having to pay tuition on your own? And I'd say where you start with is realizing that if there's an overarching theme, underneath connection, communication, and collaboration, the overarching theme is leadership isn't about you, it's about them, right? So are you waking up with the mindset, the belief system, the attitude of what can I do to serve and add value to the people that I'm leading? And if you start with that, already you're miles ahead of so many people. Because I think so many leaders end up in this, well, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, and it's a me-centric universe. And that gets you in trouble because no one gets motivated and excited to work for someone who's about me, right? As opposed to flip it around. We'll jump through hoops for people that care about us. So it starts with that simple connection. So my first thing would be shift the paradigm and make it about them, and then figure out how can you support them. Because ultimately, if you can help the people you're leading succeed, then you're successful. So it's about letting go of the reins so tightly and actually thinking of it more as a design. What can you do to design the environment for your people to thrive? And so part of that for them to thrive is they need to be connected to, they need clear communication, they need to understand what's going on and have some clear parameters so they can take the right actions, make the right decisions. And then for them to understand is how can we create an environment where they can collaborate with you as effectively as possible? So I think it starts with that paradigm shift because, we can give all the tools and the tips and the techniques, but unless you change your mindset, that stuff is not going to really take root and flourish.
Sure. I think as time has gone on, I'm seeing less of the people who are in it for themselves from a selfish standpoint, but I am still seeing a lot of people out there who are it's about me, not from a perspective of I want all the accolades or I want the recognition, but from a standpoint of I'm having a hard time quantifying my value add here as a leader outside of showing what I can do. And it's really stressful for me to kind of let go of those reins because even though I want to see my people succeed and I want them to get the accolades, I'm worried it's going to make my boss feel like that, what do I do here? I don't do anything here because I can't quantify it on an Excel spreadsheet or a scorecard that this is the contribution I've made. And so I see a lot of people out there who struggle with that, but they're good people. They want to be good leaders and they kind of struggle there. Any advice for those people?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, so one thing is I think having that conversation with your direct supervisor around, how are you being measured? So are you willing to have that conversation? I think a lot of us, even though we like to think that we've moved past that industrial age command and control mindset, we're still holding on to those little remnants of it. You just described it, right? That sense of I've got to be doing something. I've got to be showing how much value I add. Mm-hmm. When, it's interesting. So recognizing, and there's a lot of paradox that leaders need to embrace to be successful. And one of them, I think, is the fact that in one way, you're the most important person. On the other hand, you're the least important person. If things are humming along without you, that's awesome. I mean, that's great. Ideally, you should be working so well that you put yourself out of a job. So hopefully your organization has enough going on that there can be some bigger strategic fish for you to fry. than what you've been dealing with. So, can you set people up and so you're not having to be over their shoulder and micromanage, for example? So I'd say, starting off with recognizing instead of being this director controller is more, I'd like to think of the optimal leader is more of a facilitator. And facilitators are always shifting their style, their languaging, their skills based on the needs of the people they're facilitating. And so that looks different in every moment. And it's very exhausting because you have to support them. It can look like you're not doing anything, but in fact, keeping a high performing team humming along takes a lot of work, even though when the team says that they're so high performing, when they say, who made this team so great? They might not even say the leader because they'll have that. It's like what Lao Tzu said, right? The best leaders are where the team said, we did it ourselves. And so how can you make the team feel like they did it themselves?
I like what you said about how, we're moving away from the command and control. We're moving away from the how leaders used to be, the Jack Welch, eliminate the 10%. He even admitted later on in his career that what he did back then wouldn't have worked 30 years later. And so that's what I want to kind of bring up. Leadership has changed over the last 50 years. We've done series on this, on how if we look back at who we consider great leaders 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and today, they're very, very different people, but yet they were all effective and for their time. What do you think has been a lot of the driving force around why what we look at as a good leader has changed? Why has that changed?
That's such a great question, Chris. So I think there's three major factors that have changed in terms of the world and how they've impacted both society and organizations and leadership. The first one is that in general, as people, our expectations have completely changed. I mean, just think about, we live in this I'll call it the one-click society, stealing from Amazon, right? We want frictionless everything. And so our expectations of what we want from our work experience are way higher. I mean, if we think back to the industrial age, people put up with a mediocre job because there weren't a whole lot of options. You couldn't, and if there were options, you didn't know they existed. So you could have stayed in your job. Now, on the flip side, you might have had that job for 20 years and then get a pension and a gold watch. Well, those days are gone. So one thing is that our expectations of what we want out of work are a lot more than just a paycheck. Back then, people were happy with a paycheck. I just read recently, one of the number one reasons that people will look for a new job now is the inability to learn and grow, right? That wasn't a thing. That wasn't even on the radar 25 years ago.
No.
But now it's, you look at 59% of our population at work are Gen Y and Gen Z, and the expectations are so different. So the first thing is around our expectations. The next one has to do with just the whole digital world that we live in. And the fact is, because of that, we all have access to the same information. And so people know where the grass is greener. I mean, so we have LinkedIn, we have Glassdoor. And so look, if you don't give me a really compelling, wonderful work experience here, I'm going to go shopping for another one that's going to pay me 15% more base pay. And if it's mediocre, well, at least it'll be mediocre plus 15%. So what is the value proposition that you offer? And leaders, as we know from the Gallup work, is that 70% of the variance in workplace culture boils down to the individual leader that's leading. So that's the second one. The third one is this sense of transparency, is that today, everyone knows what's going on. And I use the example of, you might remember Susan Fowler, who was the engineer at Uber.
Sure.
Right? And so she's the one who wrote the blog post, My Very Strange, Crazy Year at Uber, that basically started the dominoes tipping, where Uber was found out for all the issues they had around sexual harassment, and how that led to the ouster of the top 20 people, including the CEO. And you think about that level of transparency didn't exist. She didn't have the platform for that 20 years ago. You wouldn't have a blog and a platform and a mouthpiece. So the fact is, like, anyone today with a cell phone can be an on-the-spot reporter. I mean, look at what happened with United Airlines after the one passenger was dragged off a couple years ago. And like that affected billions of dollars of market share overnight. So we live in a much more transparent world. And so in some ways, what it's forcing us to do as leaders is we need to raise our game. Now, that can all sound like, oh my gosh, you're under the microscope. The flip side is also true. When you do some amazingly wonderful things, that goes viral as well. I mean, I'm sure you know, I can't remember the name of the company, but it's the payroll company with the CEO that decided to pay everyone base pay of $70,000.
Sure. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so like that made the news, and of course that became a huge thing. That company has grown in size massively, so that's transparent too. So to me, those three things, just to recap, that being around the sense of our expectations, as well as the whole digitization, as well as transparency. To me, those are the major three factors that have really shifted the world that we live, work, and lead in.
I love that you brought up the Uber example, because I think something that is becoming increasingly widespread is because we are an entrepreneurial culture, because more companies get started in a year today than were started in 20 years, 50 years ago. Because of that, there are a lot of people who are really good engineers or product developers or idea people or entrepreneurs and innovators, and they become thrust into leadership roles because their company takes off for whatever reason. Yeah. And they've never had to lead people. They don't know how to lead people. The Uber CEO is a great example of that. Someone who should have just been a software developer and an engineer, and probably would have had a great life and never had any of the negative press if at some point along the line he said to himself, you know what, I need a CEO because I need to be the CTO, and I need to make sure that I get somebody in here who knows what they're doing in terms of leading an organization. Why do you think it is so difficult for people to let go of those reins and to kind of be self-aware around where their strengths lie and where their weaknesses lie?
I think you just named it right there, Chris, which is self-aware. To me, it's a question, if you think about what is the fundamental competence of emotional intelligence, it's the ability to be self-aware. And that is a skill that needs to be developed over time. And I think about, Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber. So I think, brilliant in certain aspects on an IQ scale, certainly technically kind of came up with this really amazing thing.
Sure.
But from all accounts, and I don't know him firsthand, but what I read in the press is that the emotional intelligence around the self-awareness is very low. And it's really easy for any of us to look at, quote unquote successful, and I'm using that in the words of like financially successful, and think, gosh, they're successful, they must be. And then we kind of give them this halo effect and realize that, he's really successful in this one domain or dimension of humanity, but really pretty arrested development in some other ones. And I think the big issue comes down to, are you able to be self-aware? Ultimately, there's a certain level of emotional maturity that comes with emotional intelligence, is that we want to go back to embracing paradox, is that it should be a both and as opposed to an either or.
The leaders you work with in your practice, I'm sure you see trends where there's kind of widespread ways of doing things where in your mind you're thinking, this is not the right way, and I know it's not going to go right for you, but I can see why you think it's the right way right now, and it's really widespread. It's not just one person, but you kind of see it all over the place. Are there any trends like that where you want them to go the way of the dinosaur, but they're just not kind of there yet?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think one of the trends that still is really out there, and this really comes from, and I did some research and I wrote about this too, it really comes from the fact that we're still living out the legacy of the industrial age. If you listen to the language of how leaders language organizational life, we're still very rooted in the world of the mechanical engineer. Basically, modern leadership started in the factory, and the first guy, Frederick Winslow Taylor, who's considered the grandfather of scientific management, was a mechanical engineer. And so you'll hear leaders always talking in these mechanistic terms about the organization, right? We talk about the fact that, we have to drill this down to the front lines. I mean, when's the last time you were sitting at work and you thought, gee, no one's drilled anything into me lately. I really missed that. Right? But like we use those kind of terms, right? We're going to like roll this out to the front lines, the ranks, we're going to kind of even look at the term human resources. You ever wonder where that comes from? I mean, it makes it sound like we're a bunch of spare parts. So it's much more of a mechanistic language than a humanistic language. And I think it's so pervasive because we've lived with it for so long, it's just second nature now. Yeah, in fact, I heard a guy was just talking about just the need. He said, we have to change how leaders work. We have to really re-engineer that. I thought, you just realize what you just said? So anyway, I think it's just one of us, is we want to talk to people like they're humans, not like they're machine parts. So that's one thing that I see that's really hard to give up.
Do you think that is rooted in a desire to sound like you know what you're talking about? I mean, there was a great marketing piece that IBM put out maybe 15 years ago now called Buzzword Bingo. They kind of coined the buzzword bingo, and it's this kind of the board member or the C-suite guy standing on the podium on stage, and the people in the audience have the bingo charts, and they have the words written in them like transparency, 30,000 feet, circle back,
optimization,
like buy-in, and you're check as he's saying things, and so funny, and it just kind of makes fun of this kind of corporate speak. But you're right, it's pervasive. It's everywhere.
It is pervasive. And I think the reason that we hold on to it, if you think about engineering, engineering is a place of complete need for abstract, concrete precision, right? If you're engineering an airplane, you got to make sure that that thing is not going to fall out of the sky. And so there's this need for that. And so you want that with machines. And so I think that we favor that in the business world because there's a part of us, look, we need stability. We're looking for predictable revenue. So we love the language of numbers because numbers they're fixed, they're controllable. Like every single meeting, 6 is always showing up as 6. It's never 7. Lie. They don't lie. Like that's why we want to what's the metric? Like we say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So metrics and numbers and this engineering language is much more controllable. Whereas we look at human beings, gosh, we are messy. We come in one day, we're in a good mood. Next day, we're in a bad mood. Some days we're more engaged. Do we share all the information? Do we not? Right? Do we have high morale? So all this is really messy. And and we can't quantify ourselves in the same way. So I think just to avoid all of that messiness, what we end up doing is we kind of stick with what we know, which is control, mechanistic, kind of stick with that command formula. And that's why it still is leaking in today, even though if we step back, we go, that's really not the best way to do business.
I think if you look at the org charts in the people side of organizations, the human resources side, the human capital side, at some point, you are leading people and you're not in the same building with them. So at the lowest level, maybe you do interact with your direct reports, right? Every day. And at each level you have direct reports and hopefully you interact with them every day. But at some point you have to hold people accountable when you don't see them every day or even every week or every month. And how do you do that without being able to look to a scorecard? How do you do that without being able to say, all right, your turnover is X and we want it to be this. Your retention is this and we want it to be this. The exit interviews are saying they're leaving because of this and we want it to be this. At some point, in order to hold people accountable, in order to hold people to a standard, you have to at some point be able to say, what are the objective things I'm doing to be able to hold you accountable? Because I can't just decide, okay, the numbers aren't where they need to be, or I don't get a feeling of they are, so I'm going to let you go without telling you exactly what numbers you needed to change. And at some point, people feel like they can't lead subjectively. They have to have these objective criteria.
For sure. I mean, to me, you want to create these objective measures because we need to be able to define some sense of reality of where we are and where we're going to, for sure. And it's interesting, you talk about holding people accountable. So my leadership philosophy is you can't actually hold anyone else accountable. What you can do is remind them of the commitments that they've already made, right? And so I think what's important around accountability is to have people co-create what these objective measures are going to be and agree to what they are, right? So it's supposed to, I'm handing this to you and you just get to say yes, because where's your commitment to that? I mean, really. And then once people have co-created these objective metrics, I can track, are we making progress or are we not? And is my first thought as a leader, if someone's not there, am I coming in saying, Chris, what's up? You're screwing up. Can I get there? We're going to have to, as opposed to, Chris, these numbers aren't there. What's going on? How can I help? What can I do to support you? Right? It's a very different framework to think that way. Because if my people aren't succeeding, what am I not doing to help them? So to me, accountability comes back to co-creating it. So I'm a huge believer that as leaders, again, going back to this embracing paradox idea, is we need to be able to hold two very different polarities. On the one hand, we want to challenge and stretch people, right? We always say, these are our goals, these are our stretch goals. I think you can do it. When I say jump, I think you can jump as high as possible, right? So that's stretch, go, 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 achieve. So that's this kind of very conditional, you can make this happen. On the other hand, there's also this polarity of this unconditional love, support, caring, concern. And I think, what great leaders do is they know when to go to what side of that pole and what's needed. And you know what? You can be the best leader, and sometimes people are not going to get there. And so that brings up the next conversation. But ultimately, where it starts is co-creating those expectations up front and being really clear on how they can achieve them.
I love that you said that because I think, and I've thought this for the last few years, that the next realm of the job offer. People talk about negotiating salary, and that's what you want, the benefits package, the salary package. I think that in the very near future, we're going to arrive at a place where when you get asked to come on board a company, part of the negotiation process is what am I being held accountable to, and what I'm committing to upfront, what I can do, and what I think is just kind of setting me up for failure because of the way things are calculated or the ways people are being held accountable now. And it's really difficult to do when you're in that kind of onboarding phase. You kind of have to do it for a while to see, okay, this is what works in this organization, this is what doesn't work. But I think once a lot of people get to that place, they feel like, well, this is just the way it is, and how do I challenge the status quo? They don't think they can. I think a lot of people work in organizations where it would be welcome if they brought it up. If they said, hey, you know what? I know you've been doing this way for the longest time, but I think if we do it this way instead, it might be better. And it might change the entire way a job is done, but it might be for the better.
I love that what you're saying that, Chris, because what you're really alluding to me is if people are coming in and as they're onboarding, really discussing and shaping the job for what they think it's going to be, is we're really moving more and more towards that results-oriented, results-only work environment, right? It's about the results. Because so often you think about the hiring and onboarding procedures, like, oh, here's the job, here's the position, and oh, and by the way, it's a 40-hour-a-week position, what does that mean? Again, this whole full-time paradigm is based on an industrial age mindset.
Of course.
Which, by the way, with people having to work from home now and everyone being remote and distributed work, dealing through this pandemic, oh, guess what? Some people are working 20 hours a week and getting their work done. Some people are working 60 hours a week getting their work done. And as a leader, you're not looking over their shoulder to see which it is. And part of you has to let go of that because you can't control it. So it's interesting in terms of how that's going to shape the wave of the future. I love what you're saying about this idea of people redefining what jobs actually look like.
Sure. The idea of the hours put in and the kind of value you get from that is a really big thing for a lot of organizations. I can speak from personal experience. When I was in my early 20s, I led a group of in-home installers for some home electronics for Best Buy. And I remember a conversation I had with a customer who called me, who was livid that they had paid $400 to have their TV hung on their wall. And what Best Buy at the time touted itself as was, it's a flat cost. It's $400. So whether it takes us, 2 hours or 7 hours, it's not an hourly thing. And that went over really well on paper because customers didn't like to be told, yeah, I charge $100 an hour, so I don't know how long it's going to take. People don't want to pay for that. They want to know what it's going to cost them.
Yeah.
And so we had that $400 flat cost, and I had a customer call me up because the installers were in and out in 40 minutes. And the customer said this was not worth $400. And it became this kind of idea that the installers, if they had, looked frustrated and slowed down and it taken 3 hours, now the customer thinks, okay, that was worth it. And so this perception of what's worth what, depending on the time put in versus the results you're looking at, is something that is heavily ingrained in a lot of us. And it's heavily ingrained in a lot of organizations. If you can get your work done in 20 hours, wow, I must be paying you way too much. And that's not necessarily the case.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what you're bringing up are these really bigger philosophical questions about what is perception of value, right? In the same way that, you can buy a $20,000 car, you can buy a $200,000 car, and if you had them both if I just told you the price, you would say which one is better, like automatically you'll say, well, the $200,000 car must be better, right? And so we have this whole sense of the perception of value and where that comes from. I think it's fascinating to see right now in the middle of this pandemic that we're experiencing, who are our essential workers, right? And what do they get paid? Fascinating, right? Suddenly the grocery store checkout person is super essential and they're probably getting not a whole lot more than minimum wage. So it's interesting how this whole value conversation, I think, is now going to be on the table moving forward in a very big and public way.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also a lot of people who, because they're working from home and they're able to get done in 20 hours what they used to sit at a cubicle for 40 hours doing, that they are kind of showing themselves and proving to their organization that, hey, you know what, I can get this stuff done on my own terms, and you're not going to see a reduction in performance, even though there's a reduction in the hours put in.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is so interesting because the science of high performance has been talking about this for years. The fact is, people can't be productive 8 hours a day.
No.
In fact, you can't really go more than really 90 minutes without a decent break. But we're operating from this industrial age mindset. Whereas, if 2 hours is good, 10 hours must be 5 times as good. And that's just not the case. We have to kind of get away from this time equals value as opposed to results equal value.
What do you think think are some of the most important characteristics or skills that leaders are going to need in the very near future that you don't necessarily see widespread yet?
That's a really good question. I think some of the characteristics that leaders will need will include, I think, frankly, it's funny because it seems like they should have now. One is just, I think, a greater degree of empathy. Frankly, the empathic skill to see people's perspective and understand how they feel, and not just understand it intellectually, but actually show empathic concern is huge. I mean, it's going on right now, and I think just moving forward, more and more, this whole question of can people bring their whole selves to work? Last time I checked, it's like 61% of the US workforce feels the need to cover their identities in some ways. And just realizing, what a psychological weight that is that people are carrying. And so, there's a big push to recognize that. And I think that because of the pandemic, for instance, is that, realizing just the need for, we're all human beings. I don't care what industry you're in, you're working with human beings. So I think understanding, and if we can tap into people's emotional centers. And I know that sounds really, on the one hand, very frou-frou and very hard to measure, but there's been all kinds of studies that show it, and all this around employee engagement, that when people feel cared for, their levels of their productivity skyrocket, as well as their levels of turnover go way down. So it's funny because it seems like the most easy and basic human thing to do. And most people have empathy for their families, for their kids, but somehow put them in a job where there's a lot of deadlines and a lot of moving parts and tension, and those skills rapidly diminish. So I'd say that, in fact, is probably the biggest early thing that leaders should continue to focus on working. And it also creates basically a much more inclusive workforce.
Sure. Well, I mean, the easiest way to have empathy for someone is to have a relationship with them first, because you get the entirety of who they are and their hopes and dreams and fears, and they become a person to you rather than just a coworker or someone else. It's really difficult. Personally speaking, I've found it very difficult to have empathy for people if I don't have a relationship with them. And I know people who can have it. There are people who are natural empaths. They have empathy for everybody. Sometimes it can be crippling. But the people who are really good at it, I think they have to start with a relationship first.
Absolutely. Yeah. Otherwise, like you said, it's an abstraction, right? They're just a box on the org chart. They're a thing to get done off my to-do list, as opposed to an actual flesh and blood person.
That's awesome. Alain, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Will you do me a favor, give us a plug for the stuff that you're working on right now, or how our listeners can learn more about you, how they can interact with you if they'd like to.
Yeah, sure thing. So I have this new book that was released on March 24th called Cracking the Leadership Code. It actually launched as the #1 Amazon bestseller in business communication. It's gotten some great press so far.
Nice.
And thank you. You can find all the information about the book at its own website, which is www.crackingtheleadershipcode.com. And while you're there, you can actually download the first chapter of the book to give it a little preview. And that will actually connect you right to my website. So I won't repeat the name of Alain Hunkins because it's a lot harder to spell than Cracking the Leadership Code. So they can go there and they can find out about with me there. And then from there, they can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I also do a lot of posting. I'm very active on LinkedIn. That's pretty much my only social media platform. So that's the place that people can learn more about me. And if people have questions, I am a leadership consultant and coach and speaker and trainer. So anything I can do to help people to grow their leadership skills, that's what I do.
That's awesome. Well, I've had a great time doing this. The pleasure is all on this side of the microphone here, and I hope
I don't know about that. A lot of pleasure over here too, Chris. Thanks.
I'm glad to hear that. I've had a great time. Listeners, please reach out to Alain. Please download the first chapter of his book and listen to it. I think he's fantastic at what he does, and I think he really knows what he's talking about.
Thanks so much, Chris.
You have a good day.